Hello and welcome to another Photoshop editing tutorial. For this video we are going to do some very basic exposure blending using Photoshop's Apply Image tool, and with this we are going to try creating a very dreamy forest scene. So without much more talking, let's jump right into it. Alright, first of course the raw adjustments. Down here you can already see the 3 different exposures I will be using for the exposure blending, and the reason is you can see with this being the base image, there's a lot of underexposure and a lot of overexposure. So I could try bringing down the highlights and increasing the shadows somehow to try and fix the exposure, but it would just look super ugly. So instead, I'm going to use different exposures, with this one being the dark one just to recover details from the highlights, and this one as the bright exposure for all the details needed in the shadows. Before we are starting the exposure blending, however, of course we need to do some raw adjustments. And as I said in the intro, this is going to be super simple. So let's start by just changing the profile to Adobe Landscape, which will give us some more base saturation. Then I am adjusting the white balance, which means I am going to bring down the temperature just a little bit. I'm also going to bring down the tint to give the image some stronger green color tones. That is looking pretty good already. Alright, so now since we're doing an exposure blending, we don't really need to adjust the exposure. All we have to do is to work on the texture, clarity, dehaze, and maybe the vibrance and saturation. So in this case, that means I'm going to drop the texture, I'm dropping the clarity, and I'm dropping the dehaze. And I'm doing this because I want to have a very soft image to get the dreamy look I'm aiming for. At the same time, I do want to bring up the vibrance, which will just add some stronger colors to the image. That's all there is to do for the base adjustments. Also, I'm not going to apply any local adjustments with the masking. I'd much rather do that in Photoshop later after the exposure blending. So the next step for this image for me is to go into the split toning, go into the highlights, and here I just want to have a very warm color tone, somewhere in the yellow range, and introduce a little bit of saturation. And that's all there is to do for the color grading. Finally, we could of course sharpen the image in the details tab. So let's do that real quick. I'm bringing down the radius. I'm also going to increase the details all the way up. Then I'm going to apply some masking and add some sharpening. And that's really all there is to do for the raw adjustments. Of course, right now we only have worked on the base image. We want to have the same settings on all the other exposures, so I'm going to hold down the Shift key and click on the last thumbnail down here. Then right click, synchronize settings, check all, and hit OK. Now with all images having the same settings, we can just say open objects. Photoshop will then open up the images as separate Photoshop files. What we want to do now is to copy every image into a single Photoshop file, with the brightest exposure being our base layer. So I'm going to the next image, hit Ctrl A to select all, and then I'm just hitting Ctrl C, go to our base image and hit Ctrl V to just insert the other exposure on top of it. Let's do that with the darkest exposure as well. Ctrl A, Ctrl C, and Ctrl V. Now with all the exposures stacked on each other, let's deactivate the top 2. And now let's make use of the Apply Image tool. Right now only the bottom bright exposure is visible. We want to keep it that way, but on the next layer we want to create a layer mask. With that layer mask selected, I'm going to Image, and here just go Apply Image. Without changing anything, I'm hitting OK, and I'm turning back on this layer. You can see how Photoshop nicely blends those 2 images together, which means the highlights are way less overexposed, but also we are losing a lot of contrast in the foreground. We can fix that by using the brush tool on that layer mask. So that means I have the layer mask selected. I'm going to pick up the brush by pressing B. I am setting the foreground color to black, since I want to make the foreground a little brighter, and thus I'm just masking out the darker exposure by just brushing over the foreground. So this way we can just add back a little bit of brightness. Alright, that is looking good to me. Now let's do the same with the top layer. Again, I'm keeping it deactivated, but I'm going to apply a layer mask. And I'm selecting the layer mask, head over to image, go to apply image and hit OK. And let's turn back on this layer. We get some further details in the highlights, which is really good. But again, the foreground is suffering from those adjustments. So using a black brush again, I'm going to paint over the foreground, revealing the details from the layers below it. And I'm just making sure to not touch the highlights. And just like that, I am working my way through the image. At this point, it might start to look a little too bright. So I'm going to pick a white brush. Let's maybe drop the brush opacity, and I'm trying to paint in some contrast. Again, I'm just painting on that very dark layers layer mask, and I'm going to introduce some more shadows where it makes sense. So that's looking really good already, and I think I'm pretty happy with that exposure blending for now. So the next step for me is to just add a little bit of glow for the dreamy look. For that I'm going to use a new layer, and let's switch the blending mode of this layer to soft light. Again, I'm making use of the brush, but I do need to change the foreground color. I do want to have a very bright color tone, maybe with a little bit of yellow in it, just like this. And I think the brush opacity for this should be fine. So I'm going to brush over most of those bright spots. And I guess this should already be enough. Now let's further work on the contrast. Especially right here in the foreground, we could use some more contrast to make the image more interesting. I'm going to do this by applying some dodging and burning, and for that part I'm using the TK panel plugin. But first I'm creating a new layer, and I'm going to switch the blending mode to overlay. Now with that new layer selected, I'm heading to the TK panel rapid mask tool, which helps me to create luminosity masks. If you don't have this plugin or don't want to pay for it, that's okay. There is a free version available with all the needed settings to do the exact same thing I'm doing here. So first off, I have the feeling I do want to burn the midtones a little bit, and therefore I'm going to activate the layer mask and just click on this little button in the back. This will apply a midtones mask on the overlay layer. And now using a black brush, I'm going to make certain areas a little darker, especially right here on the shadows of the trees. Just basically targeting the natural dark areas of the image. Okay, that looks already much better. Now let's see if we can enhance that some more. Again, I'm creating a new layer, and again I'm using the overlay blending mode, but this time instead of the midtones, I do want to take a look at the shadows. And I think the third darks luminosity mask should work pretty good. So let's go apply this as a layer mask. And again, I'm using a black brush to just add some contrast where it makes sense. That looks pretty good. So at this point I'm super satisfied with the exposure blending and dodging and burning results. You can see we came a long way from this bright exposure, doing the exposure blending, and then just applying some dodging to get contrast back. At this point I do want to add some more special effects, some more colors maybe as well. So I'm going to use the Nick Collection plugin. First, however, I want to merge all those layers into a single file. So I'm going to hit Ctrl-Shift-Alt-E because I try to work non-destructively in this case. And with that new layer, I'm heading into Filter, Nick Collection, Color Effects Pro 4. First off, let me take a look at the polarization effect. Not sure if I'm going to use it, but this usually works great for more intense color tones. So let's bring up the strength here. Maybe play around with the rotate slider as well. But I think this looks pretty good. I want to use it like that. Maybe drop the strength just a bit. And I'm also going to add another filter right away. Let's see what we can do with the Pro contrast. We could try to correct the color cast a bit with this slider, just getting some more natural colors. I don't want to overdo it, but just make use of it. Then let's see if we can use some dynamic contrast. I think that looks pretty good. Again, I do want to add another filter. This time let's go up a bit, and I want to try the brilliance warmth effect, giving this shot some more warmth and maybe some more saturation, but I don't think that looks good, so let's turn it down again, as well as the warmth effect, just like that. Finally, for the dreamy look, let's go ahead and add the glimmer glow effect. Actually, no, I'm going with the classical soft focus here under the method. I'm going with the third soft focus method, and I'm going to bring down the strength just like that. Maybe I'm bringing down the brightness some more to preserve contrast, but that's looking really good. So let's apply it like this. Alright, I'm really happy with how this is looking. So I hope this tutorial was helpful and interesting. As always, if you have questions left, feel free to ask in the comments, and thank you very much for watching this video.